What the Actual Fork podcast is co-hosted by two intuitive eating registered dietitians, yours truly, Sammy Previtt, owner of Fine Food Freedom, and Jenna Warner, owner of Happy, Strong, Healthy. We can't stand diet culture bullshit and love keeping it real. Our mission is for all humans to believe that they are made for so much more than chasing a smaller body. We are also here to share with you that food can be fun and pleasurable again. Although we are medical professionals, we are human too. We are not afraid to share our deepest, darkest secrets and how years of our lives were taken by diet culture. We started this podcast so no human has to feel alone in their journey towards food freedom. So get comfy and join us for a casual convo where you can expect to laugh, cry, learn, and grow. Welcome back to another episode of What the Actual Fork podcast. Today's guest probably most single-handedly has shaped Jenna and I as dietitians. We can easily say that. We had Christy Harrison on our podcast, who is a registered dietitian. She has her master's in public health, and she's a certified eating disorder registered dietitian as well. She has that credential. So she is an anti-diet registered dietitian, certified intuitive eating counselor, and journalist. She's the author of Anti-Diet, Reclaim Your Time, Money, and Well-Being and Happiness Through Intuitive Eating. And her second book, which we talk a lot about on this episode, is going to be called Rethinking Wellness. And I believe that comes out next year in 2022. Both of her books are from Little Brown Spark, is her publishing company. And since 2013, Christy has hosted the Food Psych podcast, which is her weekly podcast exploring people's relationships with food and path to body liberation. It has been one of Apple's top 100 health podcasts for the past 5 years, which is freaking insane, reaching tens of thousands of listeners worldwide each week. In addition to her own media work, Christy offers online courses, private intuitive eating coaching to help people all over the world make peace with food and their bodies.
Christy began her career in 2003 as a journalist covering food, nutrition, and health, and she's written for publications including the New York Times, Self, BuzzFeed, Wired, Refinery 29, Gourmet, Slate, the Food Network, and many more. Learn more about Christy and her work at ChristyHarrison.com. And Sam and I would like to take a moment here to tell you all about how she has impacted our own lives personally. For me specifically, every single client that I have worked with since reading her book, or I should say listening to it, I started reading it and then I switched over to the Audible version because at the time I was really bored of just listening to the same 5 songs on my walks. And I remember needing a book and I decided to listen to it, and her voice made all the difference to me. I remember walking around my neighborhood doing the same laps with Quincy, my dog, at the time, and either crying or legitimately like cheering and like pumping my fists in the air like a wild person, because every word that she said, I was like, I can't believe somebody else is saying the things that I feel so deeply, or validating my feelings, or putting out there things that I've thought that I haven't researched myself, or just saying things that I know in my heart to be so true. And I listened to this book early on in my splinter assing time, and it truly pushed me over the fence. And it made me really just believe so much more in this process and this work. And that was it for me. And ever since listening to that book, like I said, every client that I've ever worked with, it has been required listening or reading. It has been encouraged for people that I speak to via DMs or on social media. It is my first recommendation because I found this book to be educational, inspiring, and relatable. And I think that's a really hard 3 to achieve in a nutrition book, quote unquote.
Yes, couldn't agree more with everything about her book. So I can't even imagine how great Rethinking Wellness, her new book, will be. And I apologize, I misspoke. That's going to be published in imprint in 2023, not 2022. So don't get, don't hold me to that. Yes. But for me, it all started actually with Food Psych podcast. I remember finding her podcast somehow, I think through Haley Goodrich, who was on her podcast, like in the beginning stages. And I was like, I would like listen to it. I would go to the beach and walk every day and like listen to it. And I would definitely cry and be like, what am I doing as a dietitian? Like, I can't do this. Like, and I just like knew what she's saying was right, but had no idea how to like make that like my truth. And then when I went to a symposium in fall 2019 with Fiona Sutherland and Haley Goodrich, that's where I was leaving the symposium. I was bawling talking to Fiona and Haley about how I didn't know how I was going to switch my practice to intuitive eating, and I've harmed all these people with diet culture. And I like see out of the corner of my eye like Christy Harrison walking up because she's good friends with Fiona and Haley. And I was like, you've got to be shitting me, because I was like bawling, and I like love Christy and look up to her more than anyone. And that's funny that when we signed on today, she was like, oh, I thought you looked familiar. And I'm like, yeah, it's probably because I was like bawling when I met you. Sorry.
Unforgettable.
Yeah. But she just, it's amazing that her podcast is just so relevant, and she's amazing in so many different ways. And so we are just so grateful that we were able to have her on this podcast. And she shares a little personal nugget of information at the end. She just drops a bomb that we had no idea. So we're so excited. You have to listen. We're not going to share what that personal bomb is. So you're going to want to stay at the end, because that truly surprised Jenna and I.
Well, it was just so special. And Christy, when you listen to this, thank you so much again for your time. We are so excited for this next book to come out. And for anybody that hasn't read or listened to Anti-Diet yet, this is your sign to do that before the next book comes out. I'm sure it's going to complement it perfectly.
Yes. And then this is a perfect segue into learning all about what her next book is about, and just how sneaky wellness culture is, and kind of where it comes from, and all the conspiracies that come along with it. So you're going to enjoy today's episode. It is such a good one. So enjoy. Welcome back to another episode of What the Actual Fork podcast. Today, our guest literally needs no introduction, because we can just say her name and everybody in our community will know who she is. So thank you so much, Christy Harrison, for being here with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's lovely to be with you.
Yes. So we love to start with all of our guests, just seeing, how have you gotten to where you are today? So both professionally and personally. I know Jenna and I have read your story, and it's everywhere on the internet, but we would love for you to just share with our community how you got to where you are today.
Sure. Yeah, I'll give a bit of an abridged version, I guess. But I think the personal and the professional really sort of dovetailed for me, which is that, I started my career in 2003 as a journalist, and had just graduated from college and was sort of, trying to get my footing in this new career, and also was struggling with disordered eating, undiagnosed, really would have met the criteria for an eating disorder at the time, but I was undiagnosed because of weight stigma, basically. Even though I've always been in a smaller body, the therapist that I saw and sought help from sort of had this idea of an eating disorder that was this emaciated body that mine was not. And so, I unfortunately sort of flew under the radar. And so I was struggling in my own relationship with food, not eating enough, and basically obsessed with food as a result. And that led me to be really attracted to reporting on food and nutrition and health and all the things that I was obsessed with, and spending all my free time, Googling about and researching on, or in the early days, maybe it was even like Yahooing about or something, because it was pretty early internet back then. But so I started reporting on those beats and got more and more sort of into the environmental aspect of things, and writing about sustainability, organics, and kind of early wellness culture. Really, it was sort of early days of Michael Pollan, and the omnivore's dilemma came along after I was 3 years into this beat and this reporting. But I was really interested in his work, and Marion Nessel and Eric Schlosser, and just all about food politics and sustainability. And looking back, I can really see how that type of thinking, while certainly it jibed with my environmentalist values, it also really drove me into orthorexia, to obsession with quote unquote healthy eating. So I would agonize over what to purchase, the local, sustainable, organic, should I go for, organic that's big box, or something that's not organic, but that's local, and, just spending hours kind of comparing and obsessing over different types of foods and looking at restaurant menus. And, it all sort of, bled together in my mind, this idea of like purity and health and quote unquote wellness, but it was kind of before that was even really a buzzword. And then also like weight loss, right? The idea of losing weight and suppressing my weight and, counting calories. And so I was counting calories. I was trying to cut carbs. I was trying to do all this sustainability stuff. And so it was really a pretty big mess in my head when it came to food and nutrition. But fortunately, I had some good role models in my life, I think. I was friends with a lot of food writers. I actually dated a food writer who I think really sort of helped pull me out of the worst of the eating disorder, because I could definitely see myself going down this other path of like even more restriction and compensation and really detrimental behaviors. But when I got together with him, we started going out to restaurants a lot and food adventures. And I was like, I have to be cool. I have to show him that I'm down to go to all these different places and eat all this different food. And so in my own kind of free time, I would still restrict and do weird things with food. But when I was with him, I would eat pretty normally and adventurously. And then, as we started spending more and more time together, I started doing less and less of the weird stuff on my own, I think. And just, it got me out of really the worst of it. It's kind of like a de facto meal support. And then, flash forward a few years, I started working at Gourmet magazine, which is now sadly closed, but I was there in the last 2.5 years or so of its existence. And, met some people there who had really good relationships with food, and also some people who had, later I learned, disordered relationships with food that we kind of bonded over. But, at the time I was really sort of gravitating toward the people who seemed to be super cool with food. And so while I was reporting on things like the quote unquote obesity epidemic, which I shudder to think about now, I also was sort of personally kind of coming back to a more intuitive relationship with food. And I should say, I usually start the story actually by saying like I had a very intuitive relationship with food growing up. I was fortunate in that we always had enough food, so I never had food insecurity interfering with my intuitive eating skills. And I also have always been in a relatively small body, and so nobody ever told me I needed to lose weight. I had what's known as thin privilege, which just means, the privilege of not having people think you're too big and tell you need to lose weight and interfere in your relationship with food and your body. And so I was actually able to be an intuitive eater up until the age of 20. And that's when kind of the problem started, and, went on my first diet and tumbled into that disordered eating. So as I went along in my food writing career and, reporting on nutrition and health, it was kind of like these two polar opposite things in my head. There was the side of me that was adventurous with food and was getting back to that intuitive eating kind of love and pleasure with food, excuse me, and the satisfaction piece. But then I was also sort of increasingly obsessed with, the food environment and how it might be supposedly affecting people's weight and health, and started doing a lot more work on that. Fortunately, this is could be a whole long book unto itself, probably, this whole journey. But fortunately, at a certain point, I ended up discovering the book Intuitive Eating in some research I was doing for a book that I never ended up writing, but that kind of became the basis in a lot of ways of the next decade of my work. And that book idea was about emotional eating, so-called emotional eating. And in the process of researching that, I discovered Evelyn Tribole and Elise Resch's book, Intuitive Eating, and brought that into my therapy because I was also in therapy at the time, not really related to disordered eating, but my therapist did eventually pick up on like, you seem to have some stuff going on here with food. And so we started working through the intuitive eating book. And I think that really just launched my interest in doing this kind of work. So when I ultimately became a dietitian, I decided to start specializing in eating disorders, disordered eating, and intuitive eating. And, I think it helped take me deeper and deeper into the research on health at every size, weight bias, how weight stigma affects well-being, and all of the things that we talk about today. So.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all of that. I've read your book 3 times. I should say I've listened to it 3 times, because every time I pick up on something different, and I feel like your story and your book is one of the only ones that I've read where I was like, somebody understands me. Like, every word of your story is so relatable. And so thank you so much for putting that out there again for us. Something that I actually didn't know is when you went back to get your RD, was it frustrating for you, having done all of this unlearning and getting into intuitive eating yourself, to go through the dietitian process and sit in those classes that we all know at this point are pretty outdated when it comes to the work that we do?
Yeah, it was actually, I think I was fortunate in a way in that I had to work my entire way through school. I was already, self-sustaining and didn't really have like parental support. I had some student loans and stuff, but I had to work my way through school as well. And so it took me a long time to do my dietetic, what does the DPD stand for? I forget, didactic program in dietetics, and my master's of public health. It was like a 4-year process. And so I think, at the beginning of that, I was certainly still disordered with food. I kind of got sucked in even further, I think, when I first got into the dietetics program, just because, everybody seemed to be eating so quote unquote perfectly. And I think there's a culture in certain dietetics programs anyway, and certainly, at NYU in the early 2010s or late 2000s, late first decade of this millennium, it was very sort of keeping up with the Joneses in a way. I felt like, eating the most local, sustainable, sort of, there's a little bit of a foodie culture, but it was also very much like small portions. And, I felt like other people were watching what I ate, and I was certainly watching what other people ate. So I think it did actually trigger some things for me and make things worse in a way. But I think I didn't actually discover the book Intuitive Eating until I think my second year. And I think a turning point for me was, I think that's later that same year, we had to do the activity where you weigh yourself and you measure, different like points on your body with calipers and measure and tape measure and stuff, and sort of determine like what your quote unquote ideal weight is supposed to be. And when I did all those calculations, my supposed ideal weight was the lowest weight I had been in my eating disorder. And I at first kind of freaked out and was like, okay, I gotta like get back there. That's what my ideal weight is. How am I gonna do this? And then I pretty quickly realized, that's pretty messed up. Like, the way that I achieved that weight was through so much restriction and deprivation, and had come to learn enough in the nutrition program at that point to know what I was doing before was not quote unquote healthy. And so, I sort of decided, well, I think this so-called ideal weight is not really for me. It doesn't actually represent what works for my body. And I started learning more about it and realizing that it was actually pretty outdated as a way of calculating supposed ideal weight. And, much later sort of realized that the concept of ideal weight in and of itself is highly problematic. But I think that early sort of experience of, hey, this doesn't actually work for me, and this is pretty outdated and messed up, helped inform the rest of my sort of approach to the DPD and to, my public health nutrition classes as well. So definitely helped to have some critical thinking involved. And I had done my undergraduate actually in rhetoric and French literature. So rhetoric is all about kind of critical thinking. So I think I sort of had that reawakened as well. Like, oh, right, of course, everything we're being taught here is not gospel. And I have to, figure out what of this I'm going to take with me and what of this I need to leave behind, which I think was actually very much reinforced by a class that I took called the Social and Behavioral Determinants of Health, which blew my mind and pretty much all my classmates' minds, I think, especially those of us who were in the public health nutrition concentration, because it very much showed that, yeah, we think of nutrition as such an important piece of, such an important determinant of health, but actually these social determinants like experiencing racism and discrimination, housing insecurity, low income, lack of control in your work, like lack of a sense of agency in your job, those things actually matter a whole lot more to health than what you eat and how you move your body. So I think I had some fortunate experiences along the way, and then I was able to kind of, just hold my nose and do some of the other work that didn't align really with what I believed. But I certainly was not as ensconced in the health at every size and anti-diet and intuitive eating frameworks as I am now. And I think if I had been like a listener to my own podcast or to this podcast, or, if I had had that sort of resource at the time, it might have been a lot harder actually to reconcile the cognitive dissonance of like what I was learning outside of class and then what I was learning inside.
Yeah. That's good points you brought up. And we have so many dietetic students and RDs to be that, or, anyone in the health and wellness field that listen to this and they struggle with that of hearing like our podcast, but then having to sit through classes that are air quotes weight management classes or whatever it is. So that's awesome that you had a class on the determinants of health. Like, so jealous, because Jenna and I did not get that at Penn State. So I think one thing we wanted to talk about today too is obviously when we keep referencing Christy's book right now, we were talking about anti-diet, but there is another book to come that we are so excited about called Rethinking Wellness. And wellness culture, heavy air quotes, right? Healthy lifestyles, heavy air quotes, are all over social media. And to think back when you started, your journey and the story that you told us, like social media maybe was barely in existence. We know TikTok definitely wasn't in existence. And there's so much crap on there of people giving wellness tips. So let us know, like, what inspired this book? What can we expect for this book? And what can we be excited about?
Yeah, such a great question. So I think the thing that really inspired this book, a couple things. One is my own experience, right, of having gone through this orthorexic phase and this really obsession with eating in the quote unquote right way, and how that sort of early stage, Michael Pollan, Marion Nestle, Eric Schlosser kind of influence turned into what we now see in wellness culture, in part. I mean, there's other influences as well, like the naturopathy movement and sort of like healthism in general and health food culture that I think contributed as well to kind of where we are today. But it's just so fascinating to me to sort of trace, like, how did we get here, and the development of the internet and sort of the role that that has played in the growth of wellness culture and the proliferation of wellness misinformation online has been so fascinating to me, especially in light of, recent events like January 6th and sort of the role that the internet played in radicalizing people there, and the anti-vax movement with COVID, and how social media has really amplified anti-vax in a new way. And so I think, all of these sort of different things are outside of the scope of just, food and diet, but it's all related. It's all so interrelated. Another thing I think that inspired me was seeing clients who have gotten sucked into these things. So not only are they eating in a restrictive way and, following these wellness diet trends that are harming them and, creating a lot of disorder in their relationships with food, but they're also getting into some really kind of messed up other stuff, like thinking that they have quote unquote leaky gut and sort of taking a million supplements for that, or being told that they need to do a candida cleanse and that yeast is somehow taking over their entire body and causing chronic issues. And so, of course, you can get yeast infections, and actually there are, like, in very, very rare cases, a few hundredths of a percent, I think, of people can get systemic candida infections throughout their body. But that's such a rare thing, and it's such a completely different thing than this sort of fake, quote unquote systemic candida or quote unquote candida overgrowth that wellness culture likes to spout off about and tell everyone under the sun kind of now who goes to a naturopath or functional medicine practitioner. It feels like, most people who are in that world kind of end up getting a diagnosis of something like candida or leaky gut or chronic Lyme disease or, these things that are just really not backed up by good evidence. And I wanted to do a deep dive on that because I had seen so many of my clients fall prey to that. Adrenal fatigue is another one, and it was when I was working with some folks, I kind of was like, oh, do I touch this? Is this something that, we even need to go into here if they're seeing me for their relationship with food? And how do I handle this? How do I sort of address this with people? Because I think it's all of a piece, right? It's all this sort of misinformation and, these really harmful and toxic beliefs about not just food, but everything that goes into our body and everything that we do with our body and do to take care of our body, that we can get so obsessive about our so-called wellness that we actually completely miss out on true well-being and really are harming and denigrating our ability to experience true well-being, which I define as, really a holistic and much more holistic than wellness culture makes it out to be, sense of feeling good in your mental health, in your physical well-being to the extent that that's available to you, your social connections and relationships, and, economically, and having your needs met as well. So social determinants of health, I think, play a huge role in true well-being. And I think true well-being is a resource that's available to people no matter what their background is, but that's going to be, probably a lot harder to attain actually in more difficult circumstances. And so, my goal with this book, I think, is to sort of pull back the curtain a little bit on like what actually goes into true well-being and what are the lies that wellness culture has sold us. And it's really tricky and interesting. I'm working on a chapter now about like ways of knowing other than Western science, ways of knowing, including Western science, but also outside of Western science. And I've been really finding in wellness culture that there's this sort of interesting relationship with science where, on the one hand, it's like, well, science doesn't know, and, Western medicine doesn't get me, right? And some of that I feel like is really true. And, certainly in my own experience and in other people's experience who are more marginalized than I am, definitely feeling like Western medicine doesn't necessarily get it or have our best interests at heart or have time for us, or even, in the cases of people with lower incomes, is even available, right? And yet, I think that wellness culture has sort of seized on that understandable sort of frustration with what's on offer in Western medicine, and has twisted it and turned it into this kind of super highway leading toward all this misinformation. Like, yeah, Western medicine doesn't get you. Come over here where we know that the real cause of all your, every ache and pain you're experiencing is candida. Or come over here where we understand that, only ancient ways of knowing that are non-Western have any value, and all the Western stuff just needs to be thrown out. And I think that's really dangerous, and also really opens the door for a lot of cultural appropriation of non-Western sources of healing. And I've talked to a number of people who are practitioners in those non-Western modalities who say like, yeah, this is getting so twisted and so taken out of context, and people shouldn't be cherry picking, cherry picking tools from certain modalities and sort of grafting them onto this wellness culture hybrid of like sort of the worst of Western medicine and faux versions of, non-Western healing modalities. And, I think there's also this lionization of everything that's non-Western in a way that really sort of verges on, one of my sources, Natalia Melman-Petrozelis, says, Orientalism, right? It's this fetishization of the East and sort of commodification and objectification of it that is really not aligned with, understanding the culture and seeing people as human beings and offering people tools that are really beneficial to them. So there's a lot there. There's a lot in this book that I think is, goes beyond kind of what I've had the chance to articulate in Anti-Diet, but it's certainly still, from a basis of anti-diet culture and intuitive eating and sort of unpacking all the ways in which wellness culture drives people to disordered eating, but also looking at some of these other kind of cultural influences and these other dubious diagnoses and contested cures and scams and conspiracy theories that influence wellness culture, and that's unfortunately some people are getting sucked into when they sort of just went a bit down the road of like, I wonder if I could, fix my digestion. I wonder if I could address my eczema. And suddenly they're in this, soup of just toxicity.
Wow. I was actually listening to one of your podcast episodes this morning with Marcy Evans about gut health in general. And that episode had my brain spinning because the way that the two of you articulated all of that information, it's just something everyone needs to hear. So everybody, that's episode 175 of Food Psych. Don't go, or please go and listen to that. But we want to respect your time, Christy. Thank you so much for being here. For anybody that already does not follow you, can you please let them know where they can find you on the internet and for more updates on this incredible book that's coming?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. This has flown by. And people can find me at my website, christyharrison.com. There you can find out about my podcast, Food Psych. You can also find Food Psych probably wherever you're listening to this. If you just type it into the search bar. Food Psych is 2 words, no E at the end, PSYCH. And then my book, Anti-Diet, is in bookstores pretty much everywhere, depending on where you are in the world, but you can find it, certainly in most American and most North American bookstores if you just go into the store and find it online in other places as well. And then I also do a weekly newsletter called Food Psych Weekly, which you can learn more about and subscribe to at christyharrison.com/newsletter. That's the thing I'm like really active on the most right now because I have a little hiatus on my podcast while I'm working on the next book. We're doing rerun episodes, so we're reposting fan favorites like that episode with Marcy Evans. It's actually coming up in a few months as a repost. So people who are new to the podcast and who subscribe can hear lots of our best content. But then we'll be coming back with new episodes, hopefully in early 2022, probably sometime around May or so, because I'm actually also currently pregnant and I'm going to be taking a maternity leave in the early part of the year. So anyway, the best place to sort of stay in touch and hear about all my happenings is the newsletter, which again is christyharrison.com/newsletter.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
On all of the things.
I was going to say, I read your weekly newsletter and I love it. And I was reading your Candida one like right before we got on.
Oh, nice.
But congratulations on the pregnancy. What a great way to end this.
Yes.
Oh my goodness.
Good news to sign off. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Guys, thank you so much for listening to another episode of What the Actual Fork Pod. We know there are a lot of pods out there, and we are so grateful that you are here listening with us. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe, like, share with all your friends and faves, and follow along with us on social at What the Actual Fork Pod. We promise to continue to bring you the hottest topics, greatest guests, and the most fun you can possibly have while fighting diet culture bullshit. We love you, we appreciate you, and we will see you next week for a lot more fun.